So, we've had the opportunity to talk a little bit about emotion, and we've defined emotion as an intense reaction to an event. And we've talked about the characteristics of emotion, and so now we're going to talk about grief. But before we get into a topic that is as intense and heavy as a conversation around grief, let's hopefully laugh a little bit first. Here are two tweets that I saw recently that I thought were pretty funny. Me after making eye contact with a boy. So, like, what are we? Pretty good in terms of relationship development. And then the second, I'll probably cry at my wedding because it's a miracle. It's actually happening. So I saw those, and I thought you guys would enjoy those. Let's talk about grief, though. Dying, sadly, is an inevitable part of all of our lives. And as a result of that, we will all experience grief in the terms of the loss of a loved one. Grief can also occur in terms of the loss of other things in our life, and we'll talk about that today also. So let's first define grief as the intense sadness that follows a substantial loss. So anytime we lose something that we think has value, tremendous value to us, we experience grief as an effect of that loss. Now, as a result of that, we cannot maintain long-term intimate relationships with other people without some point losing a loved one to either death, divorce, separation, illness, or some other event that causes us to experiencing grief or to experience grief. And because of that, managing grief is enormously and uniquely taxing because unlike other emotions like anger, which we've talked about, anger is a feeling that is short-lived. Other emotions are one time. They occur only once and then we move past them. Grief stays with us for an extended period of time, and it can be triggered repeatedly by experiences that we link to that loss. That's why the holidays are such a taxing and emotionally trying time for people who have lost someone that they love, because normally the holidays is the time when all families get together or families come together. And so then when you get together and that person isn't there anymore, if you've lost someone to death, then we relive those experiences. That grief re-hits us and we feel sad and experience the effects of grief all over again. Now, time does diminish the effects of grief on our life, but grief is something that stays with us indefinitely. I love this quote that grief is not a disorder, it's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. And the only cure for grief is to grieve, to allow yourself the opportunity to feel that. There's a really cool social science about grief in 6 words. And what it is people defining their grief, the experience of their grief in only 6 words. Here's some examples. Could 6 words ever be enough? And you can see here the backdrop of this slide is a whole list of people's experiences of grief in 6 words. So you can pause the presentation now and you can look over at some of these. Very impactful and meaningful. Every moment my son was alive. Julia. His hell ended, my hell began. Mary. Softest heart in the strongest man. Everything changed with that one knock. I died with you, my son. Still, the sun rises and sets. Miss your silly little disco dance. My daughter's choice, my grief forever. So take a chance. You can pause those. You can go back. You can read some of those. But grief in 6 words or less is a particularly impactful exercise that you can do if you want to write down. Writing often helps us deal with emotion and grief. And so practice that exercise if you experience grief or have experienced it. And I think it will be helpful and very meaningful. Now, the research does say that there are 5 stages of grief. That the first stage is denial, and then we have anger and bargaining, and then we have depression, and then we also have acceptance. And so we're going to take a little look at a quick look at those items. So denial is often the first stage of grief, and denial is a normal reaction to rationalize overwhelming emotions. It is a defense mechanism that buffers the immediate shock of the loss. So that's when we are first made aware of something that is going to cause us to react in terms of the emotion of a substantial loss. And it's denial is that initial reaction that allows us to buffer that, to say this can't be happening. This simply can't be happening to me. So if we move from denial, the second stage is anger. And anger is, as the numbing effects of denial wear off, the pain of the loss starts to firmly take hold on our lives. During this anger phase, we search for blame. We start to try to identify the reasons why. Was there someone responsible for this action or for this loss in our life? We look for people and things to blame. And we start to feel intense guilt. Maybe there were more things that we could do. Maybe we could have done something differently, or if we had changed something, that loss wouldn't have happened. And as a result of that guilt, we begin to lash out at other people in our life. Now, the third stage is bargaining. And bargaining is when we begin this process of just saying, what if? What if I could do this? If I could, you'll hear people say, if I could only change places. Or maybe if someone's spiritual or religious, they'll make promises. Just give me the opportunity to have this person or this thing back in my life. And if you do this, then I promise I will be a good person moving forward. I promise I will do this. I promise I will do that. And sometimes we see this in relationships also. If you're in a relationship that has ended, that someone else has ended, we make this bargaining. Hey, give me another chance, please. Just give me one more chance. And if you give me one more chance, I promise I will be a better person. I promise I will do things differently. So we experience bargaining. The fourth is depression, and so this is when things start to settle down. And so we're through the denial phase, we're through the anger phase, we're through the bargaining phase, and we start to really just become affected by the intense emotion of our loss. And depression isn't a sign of mental illness, and in fact, it is the appropriate response to great loss. As a result of that, we experience sadness, maybe decreased sleep, reduced appetite, and loss of motivation. Those are all common experiences when we're feeling depressed. And fifth, the final stage is acceptance. And acceptance refers to accepting that the reality that we have experienced a substantial loss, and the fact that nothing we can do, no amount of anger, no amount of guilt, no amount of bargaining, nothing we can do can change the fact that we have experienced that loss. It doesn't mean that you're okay with a loss, right? It just means that we've accepted the fact that nothing we can do can change that loss. Now, with breakups, there's actually 7 stages of breakup recovery in personal or romantic relationships. This also can apply to friendships. You see here you at the bottom, and then there's shock, and then there's denial, madness, depression, acceptance. And then in relationships, there's the 2 added stages of disengagement and then finally moving on. So disengagement is when you've accepted the fact that a relationship is ended and that it's over. And then the 6th stage is you just disengage. You just no longer allow that person to consume your thoughts or your feelings. You maybe don't try to make it work anymore. You don't even talk to them. And then you decide to move on. Now, I do want to say that this author unknown quote is impactful also. Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, but not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness, nor a lack of faith. It's the price of love. One of my good friends from high school, she recently, one of our mutual friends passed away. And when someone passes away at a younger age, this particularly can impact people in particularly profound ways. Jennifer was best friends with her, and this was a post that she made in terms of her dealing with the death of our friend. As for grief, you'll find it comes in waves. When the ship is first wrecked, you're drowning, with wreckage all around you. Everything floating around you reminds you of all the beauty and the magnificence of the ship that was and is no more. And all you can do is float. You will find some piece of the wreckage and you hang on for a while. Maybe it's a physical thing. Maybe it's a happy memory or a photograph. Maybe it's a person who is also floating. For a while, all you can do is float. Stay alive. Love you, Jen. I find that particularly impactful. I heard her explaining how sometimes all you can do when you experience the loss of someone or something is just try to stay afloat for a while. Just try to make it through and know that it will get better. Now, I have this here because I think this is a very important point that we need to make, is that while there are stages of grief, 5 stages of grief that start with the denial and move all the way to the acceptance, and the additional stages with relationship failure, grief doesn't follow a particular pattern. You may start at the bottom and get all the way to acceptance, and you may be okay for a day, or you may be okay for a week, and then something happens that puts you all the way back into the anger phase. So the stages of grief are there, but most people experience it in a non-linear order. They bounce back and forth between acceptance and denial and anger and bargaining, and we may do that for a while, and there is no set period of time that says that you will experience it that way for a week or a month, and that it's going to follow a nice, neat, organized pattern. Unfortunately, that just isn't what grief looks like for us. We bounce back and forth between stages. As mentioned, grief does not just solely occur when we lose someone to death. It occurs when we have the loss of a relationship. And in this case, 5 stages of grief in a divorce. Denial is the stage when you might think that your divorce won't happen, but this could drag out the process. If you deny the fact that it's happening, it can just create more complexity in the process of divorce. Anger is when normally people call a divorce attorney, because suddenly it's not about anything other than you want to be right or you want to win. Bargaining, you may feel like you would do anything to make the pain go away, but don't lose touch with what is really important here in your happiness, and especially your long-term happiness. Depression, you may feel lonely and sad. When facing depression, don't face it alone. Make sure you have other people who will listen and help you. And acceptance this is when you realize that the divorce is the new normal for you. You will begin to have good days, and you'll learn to live as a divorced person. So when your life is intertwined with someone in terms of a marriage, and then all of a sudden that is over, that can be very, very difficult for people, because they have to find that new normal. And that new normal is going to be different for each of us. And as a result of that, you have to learn to live and then love again. And so there are stages of a divorce. I will also say, for instance, when I was in Wisconsin, my spouse and I had a house fire, and we lost a lot of personal possessions. And we come home one night and the house was on fire, and our pets were in there, and we were trying to get our pets out. Now, our pets were okay, but we wound up losing personal belongings and items, and I experienced grief with that, and it made me realize how profound grief can be with items that aren't associated with actual death of people or individuals. That when you lose a job, you can experience grief. When you have a house fire, or you live through a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado or anything like that, or flooding, those things create loss, and the substantial loss that we have with those can be very strong and produces grief, just like the loss of a person. So I want to talk about how we can support other people through grief, because if grief is an emotion that we're all going to experience through substantial loss, then we can become better communicators if we help other people, if we are more supportive of others through their grief. So William Shakespeare, everyone can master a grief, but he that has it. Meaning, we always think that it's easy for other people. We tell people, hey, knock it off. You need to snap out of it. Don't be so sad. Don't be so angry. Don't be so depressed. Get over it. You're going to be okay. That's not true. It's easy to look at other people's experience of grief and say that they should master it. There's going to be a TED Talk that I have posted for you to watch that talks about why we shouldn't do that and is particularly impactful. So, if we want to express sympathy, say, I am so very sorry for your loss. Don't say, believe it or not, you'll get over this sooner than you think. That's not helpful, and that can add to people's grief. If you want to give support to people, say, remember that I love you and you're in my thoughts and prayers. Don't say you're not helping matters at all by acting like this. To encourage emotional expression, you can say things like, let me know if you need someone to listen. Don't say, well, you shouldn't feel bad. You shouldn't feel so bad about this. Right? And so I adapt these together. If I write a sympathy card to someone, or someone is experiencing loss of job or end of a relationship, I'll send them a note or a card or maybe a text, and I'll say, I'm so very sorry for your loss. Just remember that I love you and I'm thinking about you. Let me know if you need someone just to listen. Rick. And just doing that expresses your sympathy, it gives support, and it also encourages them to reach out to you on their terms. Don't force people and say, hey, you have to talk about this. Allow them to reach out to you. Now, there's a poem called The Rainbow Bridge, and I would read it for you, but it would make me cry. It makes me cry every time. Experienced the loss of a pet not too long ago, and it's particularly impactful. But the loss of a pet invokes loss of grief with people also, because pets are a part of our lives, and oftentimes a part of our lives for many, many years. And so if someone loses a pet, I send the same message, but I'll send a link or a copy of the Rainbow poem, because I think it's particularly impactful. So you can Google that. This TED Talk you're going to see posted, so I'm not actually going to put it in the lecture itself. It will be listed as a separate link that talks about how we can manage and deal with emotion. So I just want you to remember that emotion is a very complex thing, and allow yourself the opportunity to experience motion and to go through those stages of grief. And remember that it's not a linear process. You're not going to start at denial and work your way to acceptance, and then life is going to be perfectly fine again. In fact, you're going to bounce back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between those stages of grief, and that it is lasting. Grief stays with us, and it can be provoked by our experiences that take us back to a memory or a place or time, like a holiday or a birthday or a special place that you visited or that you had with someone else. A tear is made of 1% water and 99% feelings. I think that's pretty impactful. The task of grief, in terms of tear, is to accept the reality of the loss, allow yourself to experience the pain of the loss, adjust to the new environment without that lost person, and reinvest in the new reality. So a different way of looking at the stages of grief, called the tear model of grief. There is no grief like the grief that does not speak. Pretty impactful, meaning allow yourself the opportunity to actually talk about grief and to share grief, but do it on your own terms, at your own time. Take all the time you need to experience grief, but don't be afraid to reach out to other people and allow other people to support you, because grief is so taxing on our lives. It's such an intense emotional reaction. And depression and those feelings that come with that are natural, but always remember that you are not alone, that there are other people who love you and support you regardless of the circumstance, and don't feel afraid to reach out in those instances. I hope this lecture around grief and how we can be supportive of others through grief has been useful for you.